Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Damn Parenting, your English-speaking parenting podcast from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. As always, we are your hosts, Eva and
Maren.
And today we are delighted to be joined by Faye from Kerr Psychology. Hi, Faye.
Hello. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. On this episode, we are going to be exploring how to support our children's emotional development, build their self-worth, and hopefully foster resilience from infancy through those school years that we're all going to be going through soon enough. Today, we're going to dive into the important topic of helping our children manage their own emotions. So from avoiding those common phrases like, good job, that can create extreme motivation. Instead, we want to look at nurturing those intrinsic self-worth. And we're going to discuss how parents can help play a crucial role in guiding their children through these emotional challenges. We'll also hopefully be exploring how families, especially those adjusting to a new country or school, like many of our listeners here with multicultural and international backgrounds, and how we can support our children through these major transitions. So let's get started. I don't know if I should just immediately plunge into like a really hard question or not, but how do children typically learn to value themselves and to develop like that sense of self-worth? And I mean, do you even have an age range where this is going to happen?
So I think typically children start to develop a sense of their self-worth, and I suppose start to think about, they start to compare themselves with others around the age of 4. So they start to develop a sense of themselves and who they are. And then around the age of 7, 8, that starts to become a little bit more complex and they start to think about it a bit more deeply. I know, for example, often when children experience something like literacy difficulties, they often start to compare themselves to others around the age of 7. And that's where, those difficulties really, really start to be emphasized for young people, because they do start to have that social comparison and start to notice, actually, I'm starting to experience a bit of a difficulty here.
What role then can the parents and caregivers play in nurturing this from an early childhood? Does it even start in infancy, or is it something that we really can do when they're able to talk?
Well, I think in terms of really thinking about developing self-esteem and confidence, one of the key things we need to think about is starting to develop resilience in our young people. So when they face challenges, to think about how can we support young people to be able to deal with those challenging situations. Now, as parents, we never really want them to come across those challenging situations, but we can't control that. And a lot of the time, we're not there to help them. So actually, as parents, the best thing that we can do is to really support children in developing those tools and those mechanisms to be able to respond to those challenging situations. And one of the best things you can do that to start with is by being a really supportive caregiver who is able to guide and support your child when they experience those challenges initially, to really, I suppose, be that safe base for them to be able to explore things that might be a little bit challenging for them or might be a little bit tricky for them, and then guide them through that in terms of thinking about, you found that a little bit tricky. How could you maybe look at approaching that in a different way? Or one of the things that hopefully we'll talk about later is thinking about a growth mindset and supporting children in developing a growth mindset. So Carol Dweck came up with this concept. We can have either a growth mindset or a fixed mindset in relation to challenges or learning that we come across. And Carol Dweck suggested that if we have a fixed mindset, we believe that intelligence is fixed. Whereas if we have a growth mindset, it means that effort that we put into what we do, or I suppose if we're given a challenge, the effort we put into that then determines the outcome that we come across. But when we're thinking about something like a growth mindset, it very much focuses on things like learning and challenges is all part of that learning process. And actually, we are going to come across bumps in the road, but it's all part of learning and it's all part of that sense of mastery. So actually supporting our children to know that actually when we're learning something new, it's not completely straightforward and we are going to have challenges, but it's all part of that learning process is really important. So sorry, I feel like that was quite a long answer.
I wanted to jump in there for one point when you talked about growth mindset and fixed mindset. Is that I'm understanding this correctly? Kind of like the fixed mindset would be, I'm always kind of putting the same amount of effort in because I know I don't have any really power in the outcome because this will be the outcome, versus I can dedicate more to it and then I can have an influence on the outcome. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So if we believe that intelligence is, say, for example, fixed, that then means that often children don't necessarily push themselves or challenge themselves because they believe actually the outcome is always going to be the same. But then what that then means is that when they come across something new, they can be much more hesitant in how they approach those tasks because actually they don't believe that the effort they put into it would influence the output. Whereas, for example, when you've got growth mindset, it looks at actually the effort that I put into this will then influence the outcome. So it means that children are more likely to challenge themselves. They're more likely to have more confidence in being able to achieve a positive outcome from that situation.
Because they see their self-efficiency.
Yeah.
So one thing that I then want to throw in there also, because we don't know really what an impact our communication with our child has, but this has really now confirmed me in my thinking about the theory when we want to ask our children questions, right? Like, so do you want to do this or do you want to do that? But when we don't want to do this, when we want them to do something. So the question of, do you want to put on your jacket now? If we want a yes, then we should not be asking a question, because every time when the child has then the option to say no, and but we're not willing to accept the no, so we're going to do it anyway. And I think this is then the first step of the child learning. Well, it doesn't matter if I say yes or no, because the outcome is always the same. Mommy is going to calling the shots. So I just wanted to put an emphasis really back on the importance of the communication aspect in this, and that we do have a way, an effective way, an easy way. I mean, it is easy. It's a simple thing in our mindset about questioning, but the impact is so big on so many other levels, not just in a communication, but really in like, my child knows their opinion matters and their contribution towards the situation matters. And not when they're teenagers, they also are more inclined to work with you because they don't have the feeling of, well, it doesn't matter if I behave or misbehave because my parents are always going to be angry at me. Or at the end of the day, they will always then decide whatever they want. And I mean, this leads to then problems down the road. So thank you for bringing this up, because this has really, helped me understand also then communicating this to others, why it is so important. And it's not just because I want it like that. And then everything, oh yeah, Maren is the crazy one because she doesn't know why, but that's why we do it. But now really giving also the listeners out there the background of why we are deciding to do certain things or not certain things. Also coming back, Eva, you mentioned this, good job. Why do we try to not say that? And what do we try to say instead?
Yeah. And I think just thinking about some of the things that you've said there, I think it's important for young people to feel valued and for young people to feel that, their voice is heard, and also that their contribution is also valued. Even doing little things like helping around the house, or like my little boy is only 2.5, but he loves loading the dishwasher, and his job on a morning has started to become filling the cat bowl with biscuit. And it's something that he absolutely loves. But it's a little responsibility for him that is brilliant. And it gives him a sense of self-worth. It gives him a sense of responsibility every morning, that's his little job that he does. And little things like that can just help to support that sense of accomplishment for children in terms of feeling like, oh, this is my job. I don't necessarily always praise him for that, but actually going back to what you were saying before about intrinsic motivation, it helps to support that internal motivation. So because he gets a sense of satisfaction from doing that, the next day he then wants to do it again because he gets that sense of that internal motivation. So just to kind of talk through a little bit about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is when we are motivated internally or personally to be able to do something based on it being rewarding for ourselves. Whereas extrinsic motivation is when we are, when we receive external praise or rewards, or it might be doing something because we have a fear of punishment as well. So in terms of thinking about that intrinsic motivation, we might engage in a behavior because we receive an external reward or because we're worried about a repercussion. At the same time, thinking about that in terms of extrinsic motivation, once that reward or that fear of punishment is taken away, often then that behavior is not repeated. The type of motivation that we want to aim towards is intrinsic motivation, because with it being an internal source of motivation, they're much more likely to repeat that behavior.
And then when the praise comes in, like, you know, the very well-known good jobs that the American society has actually grown up with over the last, say, 30 or 40 years, it's so natural because we're so used to hearing it, well, real life, if we're from there or have family there, or equally on television. And so it becomes such a natural thing that we fill the gap because there's an awkward silence. You don't know what else to say. So it naturally just comes in. You say good job. But the reality is you're saying good job for putting your glass down on the table, or for something so simple. And it's like they didn't do anything. They just did what, like, good job for going to the toilet. It's like, no, they know how to go now. And you're not meant to praise them for going to the toilet, you know, for just doing what they're meant to be doing. You know, that was always something that I have to keep holding my lip for, to remember she's capable, she's able, and she doesn't need my praise because she knows she can do this. And I don't want to take it away, which is actually something I wanted to bring in when you were speaking earlier, when you were talking about the ability and the capability of them. One thing I realized recently was the word I can't, the frustration of going, I know you're capable of this. I don't ask something I don't think you can do, but I ask you to do something you can. And the phrase I can't now comes up a lot. And that's something that I think is a big struggle as well, is because we're like, well, this is like, for me, the emotion of frustration. And so the only word that they can use is I can't. And I kind of think like, oh, I don't even want that vocabulary right now with you. So I'm kind of just wondering, is there any phrases or strategies you think we can help to support that element of the emotional frustration?
I also wanted to quickly jump in because what I feel is, just coming back to the good job, one aspect, and I haven't even looked at the way you look at it, Eva, which is also then very interesting, because my interpretation of why I don't use good job was always, she doesn't know then what was the good thing about it. Because when she doesn't know what led her to that result, she can't repeat it. Mm-hmm. It might by accident happen the same way, but in terms of, if I really want to focus on the outcome, I know now the single steps to take, because those steps have led me in the past to that result. So instead of, and when you say good job, then it's like, yeah, but what exactly was it? What can I repeat next time to get the same result? So, wow, you really were so focused on putting the glass on the table, and now see, nothing spilled. Isn't that great? So these kind of really identifying what exactly was it that they now learn. So, wow, now see how you push that door because you have practiced. And that's then also when you come to this whole, yeah, I can't, I also had to ask myself, how can I explain to her that she can? Because every time I said, yeah, good job. And then she says, yeah, but now I don't know how to do it because I never knew what the exact steps were that I took to put on my sock or whatever it was. So yeah, I also struggle with that, Eva.
I think there's a couple of elements here. So I think going back to the kind of challenge, I would say one of the things that springs to my mind straight away is the power of yet, of the word yet, because actually she might feel like she can't do it yet, but actually over time she most certainly will. And I think the word yet can be really quite powerful. And I think particularly when we're talking about developing resilience and we're talking about developing self-esteem in children, having that expectation that yes, you will do it at some point, but let's work together and let's figure out ways that we can really support you to move forward and to support you to then be able to achieve the thing that we're hoping to achieve. Whether that be, I suppose for my little boy, putting his pants on or putting his socks on is one of the key things at the moment. And he might not feel like he can do it yet, but over time he most certainly will. And I suppose it's supporting them to know that you have faith in them, that they will develop that at some point. And I think the other element that you were talking about is the use of praise. And I think praise has always been a bit of a contentious one. And I think looking at the way that we use praise is incredibly important. And I think there's always a place for praise. If we all think about how we feel when we experience praise, I was thinking back to a lady on the bus a while ago who my little boy was quite unsettled, and I was pulling out all the stops on this bus because I was thinking, please do not scream, really upset everyone on this bus. So I was pulling out all the stops to try and support him to regulate himself. And it was actually quite a stressful time. And I got off the bus and a lady just came up to me who had never ever met me before. And she just said, you are such a good mum. Your little boy is so lucky to have you. And the kind words from a stranger, and it was praise, but it was just so powerful. I actually went home and cried. And
Lena, was it you? Why are you walking around Amsterdam?
But in terms of the power of kind words at a moment when you need them the most, and that praise when you need them the most, can just be so incredibly powerful. And I think sometimes it's about timing it in a way that actually really reinforces or supports a young person's confidence and self-esteem. And I think you touched on a couple of things here in terms of, I suppose, ways that we give praise that can be the most effective. And I think essentially the right praise can lead to positive outcomes, and praise in the right way, it gives us a lovely mood boost and it makes us feel good. I mean, this isn't always applicable for everybody. Some people can find praise quite intimidating, or they can dislike praise, but for the majority of people, it can give that mood boost when given in the right way. And one of the ways that we can look at this is through process praise. So praising and recognizing hard work, and it goes back to tying into the growth mindset again, in terms of, I noticed you tried really hard to put on your socks. I noticed you tried really hard to draw that picture, or whatever it is that you are wanting to kind of support and reinforce. And really recognizing the hard work can then feed into developing that growth mindset. Another form of praise that can be really quite powerful is behavior specific and descriptive praise. And I know you mentioned this before in terms of highlighting what it is that they have done well. I noticed that you did so well at putting your socks on, but it has to be something that is challenging for them. And one of the difficulties is, and I think this was mentioned as well, is sometimes we can just give praise here, there, and everywhere, and actually praise is much less effective when we praise them for things that actually come quite easily to them. But when we use that praise in a way to support them in things that are actually quite challenging, that praise can feel like a boost, and it can feel really positive. And I think it's about balancing that praise and not being patronizing with that praise. And I know when I've done a lot of reading around this, one of the things that they've said is that particularly with older children, using that kind of descriptive praise can at times feel quite patronizing. So I suppose it's kind of balancing that a little bit in terms of, I suppose, judging the age and the development of the child and how they may potentially respond to that praise. But in terms of thinking about descriptive praise, an example of that would be, I really like the way you shared that toy. So that's the developmental stage that my little boy is at the moment, and I give him a lot of very descriptive praise around that. I really like the way that you gave your friend a packet of raisins, but just something like that really helps to reinforce those behaviors that we're looking at that I know he finds quite tricky. Whereas if I praised him, say for example, for building a tower, that's something that he finds really easy to do now. So actually that praise is going to be a lot less effective, if that makes sense.
I was just going to say, can I challenge you on that? Because the thing is, like, this is the problem I have with praise. I find a lot of different people praise in different ways. And I really struggle with this as much as I will praise, and I have to hold my breath from trying not to overpraise. But it's the fact that I always still feel that even saying, I noticed, like, for example, the sharing thing, this is a massive thing, obviously, for children between 2 and 4 or 5. And we've been going through it a lot. And it's a case of like saying like, oh, I noticed you did that. Like, I always feel like that's to me extrinsic, because it's me telling her, oh, I noticed this. And then she's going to go, oh, I want mama to notice it again. And so that's my struggle when you talk about this, that I'm like, is it intrinsic or extrinsic? So I always try to reword it like, oh, how does it make you feel? You know, the thing is, but I don't want to keep using that same stupid phrase all the time, because I'm like, exactly like you say, is if you keep overpraising it, you're basically liquidating that feeling, and it becomes just another word and phrase, and it actually doesn't give you a sense of what it's meant to and the power that it actually provides. So that's why I was just wondering, is there any other ways or phrases you might be able to give us? Because the I noticed, or I'm so proud of you, apparently, no, you're not allowed to say that. And I'm like, why? And it's like, well, that's extrinsic. So I'm like, okay, what do I do? And then it's like, oh, you say, how does that make you feel? And I'm like, but that's the same question I have to keep asking her now.
I honestly think it's such a tricky one. And I don't think you can ever avoid completely supporting them in terms of that extrinsic motivation. And I do think there is a place for it. And sometimes I think we've maybe got to support through extrinsic motivation to then support intrinsic motivation. A really lovely strategy that I've heard, and I apologize, this kind of doesn't necessarily fit with exactly what you said, but is using, I suppose, praise in a certain way where you talk to perhaps their teddy bears. others, and they then overhear really nice things about themselves. So something like, oh, tell you what Freddie did today. Freddie was great at sharing his digger in the sand pit. He did such a good job. And I suppose, again, it is extrinsic motivation, but it's always nice to hear positive things about yourself. And actually, I think a little bit of extrinsic motivation can probably feed into that intrinsic motivation, because the more they'll want to engage in that behavior, but then surely over time, particularly with sharing behaviors, naturally that becomes self-rewarding in itself. But we could argue that that initial motivation, we might need to give them a little bit, when I might need to give them a little helping hand with it. But then the more that they are engaged in those behaviors, the more that becomes self-motivating. Does that make sense?
It's getting there. It's just, yeah, as I said, I just feel like maybe I'm reading too many different people and they're kind of all on top of each other.
I honestly think there's probably quite a lot of contradiction around this.
Oh, yes, of course.
Beliefs. And as parents, I think we've just got to find our own balance ourselves, haven't we, in terms of what works for us, what works for our children, because what works for one child might not work for another, and it might be completely different.
To jump in about, and maybe also giving you a little peace of mind, Aoife, how I also view this with the internal, external motivation. And coming back to what you said, Faye, distinguishing, was this a task that was easy for them and that comes natural, or was it something that we know they challenge with? And so giving your daughter attention for sharing a toy when you know this has been topic of discussion, she has a hard time with this, and then addressing the moment when it did happen, or you know this, it comes easy to her. So I guess there will be then situations in her character, and like really distinguishing when, like, what is her character and how can we build up those character traits? Because also for us, I mean, I as an adult have areas where I need so much extrinsic motivation because I don't care about this topic. It doesn't interest me. I don't have any intrinsic motivation when I do my taxes. I'm sorry. Like, I have to have extrinsic motivation for that. However,
and as ADHD, like, yeah, there's no dopamine in anything. So,
but when I have to go networking now, I love it. So I don't need anyone from the outside telling me, oh, how great it is or what it impacted, blah, blah, blah. No, I love doing it. So I don't need, so also I'm allowing myself these fields of comfort with certain topics, or comfort or interest with certain areas. So I think this is also what we can learn, that this is also for our children. This is their character. So what is their personality? And so maybe it helps you then to really see, okay, is this something where she needs that because she has a little space to grow into that more, or it is easier for her? Because I know for my daughter, sharing is very hard. But then going to talk to other people is not so hard for her, because that's just her character. So I really try to see, like you said, it's not just building the block, but it's also the social interactions and those kind of things.
It's also important, I suppose, when we set boundaries as parents, to reinforce those boundaries as well, in terms of, so for example, supporting them to develop the skills in sharing and turn taking, to provide that feedback around, actually, you're doing a great job in sharing. And actually, then I suppose developing those skills in terms of knowing, oh, actually, that's how I share. And that reinforcement is actually really important. And it might be technically classed as extrinsic motivation, but also at the same time, what we want to kind of steer away from is that always being those negative interactions. So constantly saying, don't do that, or don't do this. And actually you want to, I suppose, provide that reinforcement around, actually, yes, that this is what we want to see. Because often when we are guiding children around that, we can be like, oh no, don't do that, don't take that toy, but actually we want to kind of reframe that a little bit and really think about, well, actually, what do we want to see? So providing that feedback around that can be really important.
What you're saying reminds me of someone that said, basically every time you use the word don't do whatever, all the kids hear is just you repeating the same thing. So they just keep hearing it because they don't really comprehend the don't element of things. So they're like, don't throw the food on the floor. And they're going to be like, okay, throw the food on the floor, because they're not understanding that whole concept of don't. There's no point of doing it, but just use the words of what they should be doing. So it's always that. But again, for anyone listening, it's really hard when it's the breakfast time and you might have slept in, or you've got like 3 kids running around. The dog is trying to eat your kid's breakfast muffin, and it's just, you're freaking out and you're just trying to use the correct words. And this is the problem, is trying to remember and trying to stop yourself before you go into that element of don't. It's a very fine line that is so easily that you just jump across it already at 7:05.
Absolutely. And we're all human. And we've all got our own tolerances as well. And like, we might have had a terrible night's sleep. You might be feeling stressed about a meeting that's coming up. And actually, we all have situations where we've responded to our children where afterwards we think, oh, I could have dealt with that so much better. I think what we're saying here is it's about, over time, as much as we can, kind of reprogramming the way that we respond as much as possible. We're not always going to get it right 100%. Nobody 100% ever gets it right. But I suppose reprogramming the way that we respond as much as we can. And I suppose reframing it. And it reminds me of a concept called mentalization by Peter Fonagy. And what he suggests is our interpretation of our children's behaviours can have a huge impact on how we respond. So say, for example, our child behaves in a certain way, we can perhaps perceive that that was quite a playful way for them to respond, or they're being a little bit cheeky. But if our perception is that it was a positive thing, we're much more likely to respond in a positive way to them. Whereas if our perception is that they're being defiant, or they did that to frustrate me or annoy me, and our perception of that is quite negative, then actually what then happens is then our response can then be more negative. And I suppose it's again about shifting that mindset that we have about our children and how they're responding, and how can we really understand why they're engaging in a specific behavior, and can we see it as more positive, or can we reshape it in a certain way? And again, when you're in the thick of it, and when you're stressed and there's lots of things going on, it's not always possible. But as much as we can, if we can try and kind of shift that perspective and think about things in a more positive way, can that then support us to respond in a more positive way too?
Yeah, it's all about compromise. If you really want to have kids and you have the children at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years old and they're getting ready for school, you have to remember they're not robots. They're not just going to do everything you say. These are little humans with little brains, with little intentions and emotions that go with it. And it's to figure it out. My next question I have, so this is going to be probably a little controversial. I want to talk about those praise and rewards. So it's a case of, recently I saw someone had a little jar. And so every time their kid they were using the potty or the toilet, and every time they did a pee or a poo, they put these little things into the jar to reward the child. And when the jar got to a certain stage, the child would get a toy. And it kind of triggered me, because I was like, this is a major learning development for them. And I was kind of like, oh, you're extrinsically placing this thing instead of getting them and their body connected to understand what they're meant to be using. And it triggered me in such a way. And then that leads into back in the olden days, back when I was young, those stars that you would get in school. And they were like, if you did a good job that day, you get your star. If you did your homework, or if you got a certain grade, you'll get a star. And if you got so many stars, I don't know, you don't get homework. I can't remember. It's a long time ago. Forgive me. But what would your thoughts be on that side of things?
I think it is a really tricky one. And I mean, personally, for me, I don't use methods like that, just because I suppose going back to kind of the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation side of things, it's very much an extrinsic motivation factor. And I think looking at supporting something like using the potty or using the toilet independently in a way that supports that intrinsic motivation is, in the long term, going to be much more effective, and it's going to sustain that in the longer term. Thinking about it, and I know you mentioned there about in the classroom, and it being used in the classroom in terms of being given stars or kind of visible methods to reinforce behaviours. And I think that one's a really tricky one in itself. And I think as well, when we're thinking about children and self-comparison, and particularly around the age of 7 and 8, where they're really, really starting to notice the differences between them and other children, I think that can have quite a detrimental impact on their self-esteem and their confidence, particularly if lots of other children around them are getting stars, but then they notice themselves that they're not receiving stars, even if they're trying really hard. And I suppose it goes back to what are they being given those stars for? Are they being given those stars for their ability? And particularly if you've got children who find certain areas really difficult. So say, for example, it's a chart on spellings. So every child who gets a star for getting 7 or more spellings right, you're going to have some children who find literacy really, really difficult, and they're not getting any stars, but yet they might be trying incredibly hard. If we're looking at those kind of methods being more supportive, is it around, again, giving those stars in relation to the effort that's been put in, rather than the achievement or the outcome at the end, if that makes sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's
coming back to the growth and fixed mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I do feel like it's a bit of a controversial one because people feel like it's just so simple and it's effective and you can easily buy those things to have in your home. So yeah, so that's why I kind of wanted to tackle upon that. Coming back to our own little community here. So for the families who've recently moved to a new country and whose children are trying to fit into a new school, are there any specific emotional challenges that these children are going to face? And how can these parents actually support them during this transition?
I think this is always a tricky one. I think in terms of moving to a new school, for example, or a new daycare setting, it's always really tricky. And I actually thought about this in quite a lot of depth recently when thinking about my little boy starting daycare. So he started daycare when he was 2, and starting daycare in itself is a huge change when he pretty much spent most of his time with me up until that point, or familiar babysitters or family. And actually, he was put into this new environment where he didn't know anybody. They spoke Dutch, which is an added challenge for him to navigate when he had never been exposed to Dutch before, and a new environment, new toys. And for him, it was huge. And I think for me as a parent to take a step back and really acknowledge that was really, really important, that actually there's a lot going on for him right now. And I know other people who are friends who are going through a very similar situation right now where their child's transitioning into daycare and their sleep's completely up and down and their emotional regulation is very up and down. And actually, I suppose one of the most important things we can do as parents is to acknowledge how tricky that period of time is for them, and to be there and work alongside them and think, right, how can we support you during this tricky time? Is it about just being emotionally available for them to make sure that we can support them when they're with us, to develop some of the strategies, or to develop some resilience to really be able to manage that situation? One of the really lovely strategies that I talk about quite a lot is making sure that we have periods of time where we are able to really connect and spend time with our child as much as we can. Now, I realise that every day this might seem like a challenge, but even looking at kind of like 10 to 15 minutes a day of undisrupted time with your child can make such a huge difference in connecting with them. So when I talk about undisrupted time, it would be away from social media, away from jobs, any housework, or even the TV, having everything switched off and trying to just provide that 10, 15 minutes of complete engagement with your child where they direct whatever it is that they want to do, whether it be reading books, whether it be playing, but really filling up their emotional cup for that 10 to 15 minutes can make such a huge difference in supporting them to then go and face some of the challenges. So I've noticed a huge difference in my little boy. If I do this first thing on a morning, and I realise not everybody has this luxury of being able to do that, I try and give him 10 minutes on a morning where I say, right, whatever you want for 10 minutes, whether it be read books, whether it be play. And I've actually found that has quite a significant impact on then how he presents in daycare. And there was one day where I didn't do it and he had a really tricky day, and I was like, oh no. And it could have been a complete coincidence, but actually I personally see that there has been quite a big shift in how settled he is just from giving him that 10 minutes of undisrupted time. There's lots of other things that we can think about as well. And I think one of the most important things we can do is listen to our children. I think particularly when children have the language to be able to express themselves, what are the things that they are worried about? Because it's a huge shift starting a new school. And there've been lots of new people around, new teachers, really speaking to them about what is it that you are worried about at the moment, or is there anything that you're worried about? And what can we do to prepare you? What can we do to really help you to go into that environment? So, for example, one of the things that I, in the past in particular, used to find quite tricky was going into new social situations. It used to give me huge anxiety. And if I was going to be speaking to somebody or a child who was experiencing such difficulties, I would kind of maybe talk to them and say, well, how could you maybe think about how can you support yourself in that situation? What could you do? Could we maybe look at setting up a couple of scripts or a couple of like sentence starters for you to use just to start a conversation with somebody, or just to or topics to perhaps talk about for them to feel confident in being able to engage in interactions with others. So it's very much around how can we give them the skills to be able to counteract whatever it is that they are worried about. Also supporting them in developing strengths, or I suppose the correct term would be developing mastery in something. So supporting them to find something that they're really interested in, and even if it's something new or something that they're working on, but really developing mastery in a certain area can really help to develop their self-esteem. And the difficulty it's not necessarily a difficulty, but when looking at self-esteem, it's on a continuum. So you can have low self-esteem, high self-esteem, but also at the same time, you can have low self-esteem in one area and high self-esteem in a different area. So say, for example, a child might be great at sports, so they might have really quite high self-esteem in, say, for example, playing football or hockey or whatever that might be, but then they might have quite low self-esteem in relation to their learning or social experiences. But actually what we found is if we can really support young people in feeling a level of mastery and feeling like they have high self-esteem in a certain area, that can then help to counteract how they feel in a different area where they might find things more challenging. So I suppose it's balancing the positive with the negative, isn't it? And trying to make sure that those positive experiences balance out those more tricky experiences.
I've actually heard about this.
Themselves then, because they know there is a version of me that already in that field knows how to do it. So how can I model myself? And we can do this so easily, even with the toddlers, when we can say, so how did you stand? Can you show me? How did you stand out? Like, where were your hands? So like really scanning with them how did they physically stand up there? And then can you tell me what voice did you use when you said that? And like really showing them that there is a version of you already there. You can look at it and you can really learn from yourself and then model it into those other different areas. And that's so powerful when they know I am able to do this under these circumstances. So my body and my mind has experienced the efficiency of it.
The thing you just said there actually reminds me of something I did hear. And I think it was someone in America. And they were basically saying that when your child is excelling, as you say, in sports, but they're like failing in maths, instead of hiring that tutor to come in to help them with maths, it's hire someone to help them excel even further, because it builds up such a level of self-esteem that they feel more capable. And you can always work